Hi, and welcome to Photoshop for Beginners or users who need a refresher. This is part 3 of a 3-part lab where we talk about some of the key tools and functions in Photoshop. As I've said before, if you haven't already done so, please be sure to download the workbook that gives you a bit more information and some step-by-step exercises to really help understand these functions even better. My name is Dave Cross. It's been my pleasure to host you for the first two and for this third part of this session, which hopefully is introducing you to some ways you can really take full advantage of Photoshop. Last time we looked at two very important topics, making selections and working with layers. And we're going to build on those today by talking about two other very important functions. The first is working with smart objects and smart filters, and the second is retouching and removing objects from a photograph. Now, the topic of smart objects is an interesting one because sometimes when I talk to beginners about smart objects, their initial reaction is, that seems a little advanced perhaps for a beginner session. But if we're really focusing on what we talked about in the first session of working non-destructively and creating good work habits, then the smart objects and smart filters are a big part of that. So here's kind of the nutshell version of how this works. Normally when you work with layers in Photoshop, you have pixels on those layers, and if you make any editing changes, as we've talked about, that's fairly destructive, especially things like resizing. When you convert a layer or layers into a smart object, it's like it puts it inside a special container, almost like a protective wrap, if you will, which means it still looks the same, but it gives you more capabilities. Here's an example. So in this case, you can see I have a logo and it's on a transparent layer. So if I hide the background, there's our logo. And if I use free transform, Command or Control T, and hold down the Option or Alt key so I can scale towards the center, I can make it much smaller. And when I hit Enter, it still looks pretty good. However, in normal way of working in Photoshop, we have to realize that's like its new size. That's 100% size. So if I didn't undo it and saved it this way, that would be the new size of my logo. Which means if I then came back later on and tried to free transform back up again, you're going to see it's losing quality dramatically. Because anytime you scale something larger in Photoshop, it's going to have a negative impact because Photoshop is having to try and invent information to fill in all the gaps. And you can see it just doesn't look very good. So we're going to step backwards to the point where we had our original logo. And instead we want to convert this to this thing called a smart object. Now there's various ways of doing that. We can go to the layer menu and choose smart object, convert to smart object. Or if I undo that, I can also control click on the Mac, right click right on the layer and choose convert to smart object. It's the same end result. Now, this time if I use free transform the same way I did before, I'm going to scale it down really small and hit enter. The difference is, unlike the first time, the smart object in a sense remembers the information inside of it. Take a look at our layer and you'll see there's a small symbol on the corner of it that's indicating it's this thing called a smart object. So now if I free transform and scale back up again, it doesn't lose any quality. Now it's important to note that it doesn't mean you can scale it larger than the original. You'll still lose quality in that case, but at least the ability to scale down and back up again from an experimental standpoint is very important. And this is just the very first initial thing you can do with smart objects. But here's the roadblock that most people run into. As soon as you convert a layer or multiple layers into a smart object, the rules change. Normally, in a regular layer, if I wanted to add some more paint to it, I could grab my paintbrush, I could choose a color and start to paint. But in this case, I get this symbol, which is telling me I can't do it. And if I try to paint, it's saying this smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Well, rasterizing is like taking away the advantage of it being smart. So I'm going to hit cancel. So the question becomes, well, how do I edit a smart object if it's not letting me? And the way we do it is you double click on the thumbnail, which shows the smart object. It's going to open a separate window with just the contents. So here, for example, I could add a layer and I could add a bit of color to it. Now I want it to update back here in the original document. So in order to do that, I have to hit save so it knows I've made a change to the contents. Now when I come back to the original, you'll see it has changed. Now, obviously I didn't make the best choice in terms of the way it looks, but this is the process. And this is the part that causes confusion at first for people, is the idea that you have to go to a separate window to do this. But like anything, once you get used to it, it can actually be fairly beneficial. So I'm going to actually undo my paint here. In this case, I'll just do a little bit of paint here and maybe lower the opacity a bit. And again, hit save. And when I come back to the original, you'll see it updates. So as I said, this part takes a bit of getting used to, but it offers many, many advantages. So here's a little exercise we're going to go through, and it's outlined very step-by-step in your workbook so you can see how this works. What I suggest you do, I'm just going to close some of these other documents so we don't confuse matters. I'm going to create a new document. Let's do 1290 by 1080 since it's there. And all we're going to do is add 3 layers. So just hit that layer button 3 times. On the top layer, we're going to use our marquee selection tool to make a rectangle, and we're going to fill it. Actually, this color is fine, so we'll just go under Edit, Fill, switch it to foreground color, click OK, and then Command and Control D for deselect. Then on this next layer, we're going to add another rectangle, but make it long and thin. And let's pick a different color and choose Edit, Fill, deselect. And finally, on the third layer, we're going to switch our rectangular to elliptical marquee tool. Hold down the Shift key. And on this one, let's just put everything back to like black and choose Fill for that one. And deselect. You'll see now I have my 3 layers, and I want to take my Move tool and drag this layer in, and then click on my circle layer. We're going to position it so that it fits, and then finally, I'm just experimenting here just to try different things. I'm going to do Free Transform, hold down the Shift key, and just pull the bottom of this so it lines up, and then hit Enter. And we're going to pretend, for the sake of argument, that's our logo that we have created. We want to have access to all these individual pieces, but we want it to act as if it's one document or one layer. So we're going to click on the bottom layer of the 3, hold on the Shift key and click on the top layer, and then Control or right click and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now it looks visually as if these layers have been merged, but that symbol again shows us it's still, I still have access to all this content. So at this point I could position this, use it in other documents, whatever I wanted to do, but if I need to edit it, I double click on it and you can see there's all the separate layers. If I need to change the color or the position of one of these logos, let's just do this. Let's take this layer, drag it over here, and then take our circle layer and drag it like that. And so that's going to be our adapted logo. I hit save, and when I come back here, you'll see it updates. So what I'd recommend is to get used to this concept of working with smart objects is continue to go back and forth, make some change. You could change the color, you could even add another layer. And say we're going to take that one and fill that with the background color, which is white, and click OK and deselect and hit save, and it's going to update. So if you do that a few times and you start to get used to the concept of how smart objects work. Now in your workbook, you'll see other examples of how you can take advantage of this. The other part of working with smart objects is taking advantage of something called smart filters. And normally when you on a normal layer, when you apply a filter, it's kind of a one-shot deal. Now, you could make a selection first to say this is the area that I want to apply the filter to, but once you have applied the filter and clicked OK, it's kind of a one step that later on, if you wanted to edit it, you couldn't. It'd be part of that fairly destructive way of working. So one of the added advantages of converting one or more layers to a smart object is it also means that a smart filter can bring into play, and this is very important. So in this first example, I'm going to deliberately make a mistake from a good work habit standpoint, and you'll see what I mean in a second, is I start to say, well, I want to make a selection, because this part is already sort of a soft focus. I want to make it even more so. So I make my selection, but if I went directly to the filter menu to blur, let me pause for a second and think, well, as part of that checklist we talked about in part 1, do I really want to be working on my background layer? Probably not. So one of the things that I can do is actually take my background layer and convert to a smart object. Now, just so you see, if you look under the filter menu, you'll see there's a command called convert for smart filters. Imagine it says in parentheses, by making it a smart object, because it's exactly the same thing. It doesn't matter. All you're going to do is get a message like this that tells you that. So now this is a smart object. So here's the difference. In the first example, when I was going to just make a selection and then apply a filter, I would have had one shot to decide. Now the difference is if I go to the filter menu, and let's just do blur, Gaussian blur, you can see it's showing me a preview. And right now, because I have nothing selected, it's going to affect the entire image. Now with a normal filter, this is the part that people agonize over because they're like, well, what amount of filter should I put in here? Well, in this case, it really doesn't matter that much, because when you click OK, you'll see that the filter actually appears here in the layers panel. There's my blur. I can turn it off or back on again, and I can also double click on it to change the settings itself. So one approach you can take is to deliberately blur perhaps a little more than you want, and I can take my brush tool and using the concepts that are very similar to a layer mask. Let me first do my checklist, normal mode, opacity 100, okay, good. Anywhere that I don't want my photograph to be blurry, I start painting with black, and I'm hiding the effects of the filter. Now in a case like this where there's a lot of painting, it might be easier for me to take a tool like my lasso tool and just select this entire area and then choose fill with black and then continue painting on these other areas that I don't want to appear blurry. Now that I've done that, this looks a little too blurry, so this is the advantage again of the smart object and the smart filter, is I can double click on and say I just want it to be a little more subtle. So back when I was talking about working non-destructively, one of the things I said is sometimes you might want to deliberately overdo something to help with accuracy. This is an example. Instead of doing a very, very slight blur and having a hard time seeing what I'm doing when I'm painting on the mask, by over blurring a little bit, it makes it a little easier to see what you're doing. And like anything non-destructive, this is not permanent. So if you click OK, that's just how you've left it for now. And you can continue to work on it. For example, I can see that I missed a bit here, so I need to take my brush tool, let's make it a little bit smaller. And now I can gradually paint back in these other areas that I don't want to be blurry. Remembering that at any time, of course, you do have the option of turning this on or off, just like we do with anything in the layers panel. And you can also apply multiple filters to a smart object and be able to turn them on and off independently. So it offers a lot of possibilities. So for many people, the concept of smart objects themselves is a little bit confusing at first, but at the very least, I would suggest you explore using smart filters anytime you're trying to apply a filter in Photoshop, because it just gives you way more control and flexibility. Now, as I mentioned before, if you look in the workbook, you can see some other examples of how to take full advantage of those smart objects and smart filters. Now, the last topic for this session is removing things or retouching your images. So taking advantage of the ability to remove things or realistically cover them up. I always say that because the most common way people will say things, I need to remove this out of my photograph, well, you can't technically remove something. You have to cover it up to make it look like it was never there. And thankfully, we have a number of tools and functions in Photoshop that make this very easy to do. So I'm going to open this photo called Venice, and in here you'll see there's a couple of boats, especially this one in here that's a little bit distracting. I want my attention to be focused mostly on the gondola. So I want to quote unquote remove this, which again really means cover it up. Now, thinking back to our ongoing concept of working non-destructively, even though I want to cover this up, I want to do it in such a way it gives me the most control, and that is adding a new layer. Now, if this bottom layer was a smart object, I would have to do that in order for this to work. But even with a regular layer, to me, this is still the best way to do it. So we have a number of different options. I'm going to go through them really quickly here for you to show you what's available. So we have the spot healing brush, and we have to go through our checklist. We're just going to make sure it says Content Aware up here, and Sample All Layers is turned on. That's very important. Now we have, in effect, like a painting option here. So we're going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see what we're doing. And all we're going to do is paint over our boat a little more area, and then it just generates pixels looking at the surrounding areas. And it does a pretty good job. If we zoom in a little closer, it's not bad, but we can still see there's a bit of a problem with the wake of the boat. So that's okay, but we probably still have to do some further work in these areas to make it look the way that we want. So Spot Healing Brush usually does a pretty good job. The only downside to it is it picks areas that it thinks is a good idea, and sometimes it'll just pick incorrect or ones that aren't the greatest choice. So choice that I prefer is the patch tool. Again, Content Aware, Sample All Layers. I'll show you one of the main reasons why I like this tool. There's a couple of them. The first one is you make a selection around the area that you want to cover up, and then as you click and drag, you can drag to an area. So this way you can see, well, that's not a good choice. And as long as you're in the relative ballpark, I would say, of the colors, that's fine, because it's going to do the patch. But then up here in the options bar, unlike most tools where you can't change these settings are still live. So if you go in, you can try different settings and see the result. In this example, a high structure looked like a pretty good choice. Let's put the color up to its maximum, see what we get there. That looks like a pretty good choice as well. And at this point, we can deselect, and it's done a pretty good job. Now, in a similar function to the way we talked about making selections, I want to end up with covering it up in a way that looks good. So what I may end up doing is do the patch tool first, and then do a little bit of spot healing here and there to finish it off. The other option that we have that's available to us that's really interesting, I'm going to take my lasso tool and make a selection around this boat. I'm going to go under the Edit menu and choose ContentAware Fill. And actually enters this completely different workspace where on the left it's showing you the area you've selected, and on the right it's showing you the fix, the result that you're going to get. And as you do this, you might find, for example, in this case, it looks pretty good, although I can see if we zoom a little closer in, there's some dark areas of water right in here that don't look quite as good. So over on this side, I'm just going to paint, and I'm telling Photoshop, don't include this information, and then it updates. Now, there's all kinds of controls over how this works, but generally speaking, just this idea of being able to control and pick what areas you want to use as your fill, and it blends it in perfectly for you. You can also have some control over settings like color adaptation, which will adjust the way that it blends in. Sometimes you can even do like rotation or mirror to get the results you want. Now you'll notice in this example, unlike the other retouching tool where I had to make the new layer first, in this case, I just changed the output to new layer, and when I click OK, it will generate a new layer with that information already on it. This is an example of a tool in Photoshop that just continues to get better. In the first version or two, it was very good. Now it's got better because it does it more automatically and gives you more options, including the ability to apply a little bit at a time if you want to keep adjusting as you go. But the key thing, remember, whatever tool you're using for retouching or covering up, is to make sure you're still doing it non-destructively. Not necessarily because you're going to change your mind, but because later on, if you might look at it with a fresh set of eyes and realize it still needs some work, you know you still have the ability to go in and take one of these tools, like, again, the spot healing brush, and just do some additional little bits of work if necessary. So in this session, we talked about two key topics. The first was smart objects and smart filters, and the second was replacing or retouching. But I want to also stress once again, and the workbook gives you a bit more detail on all of these, but also a couple of other things. In the first part, I talked about good work habits and working non-destructively, and both of those are tied into the same thing, and that is that I highly recommend that as you're working, you save a layered document as your master file, as your working file. You can always come back, and you can do that by saving either as a PSD or a TIFF file, and either one of those will preserve everything you've done, including masks and smart filters and smart objects and multiple layers and so on. And then you can save copies that are flattened. So rather than ever merging or flattening your layers, I highly recommend you get in the habit of creating that overall master file that has all your layers in it, and then making copies where necessary. If you want to learn more about me or see some of my other training, you can go to either learningphotoshop.cc or the Photoshop Virtual Summit, pssummit.com, to learn about the next upcoming event. I'm Dave Cross. Thank you so much for joining me for this lab.